So, it's better late than
Yeah,
never.
I'll join you after you.
As you can very well see that it's not only that human beings have emotions, machines have them too. We approached them in a rational way and we came out with irrational responses. So you don't need very highly advanced artificial intelligence to become emotional. So it gives us great pleasure indeed to welcome Professor Agnieszka Bohnert, who I discovered in Warsaw. Really a very, very unusual scholar. She has she's lived and has largely been groomed in Poland, but also studied in Germany. Is very, very well acquainted with the German scholarly environment. And she actually does some research which is quite unusual for political scientists, either in South Asia or in Germany. And if you have read the abstract of this talk, which is emotional responses in Pakistan politics to the liberal world order and democratic values, it starts off by saying that Pakistan's formative ideological scaffolding was strictly based on emotions, which became an inherent part of Pakistani reality, making it a unique case study for exploring the role of emotions in politics. And it goes further to suggest that the role of emotions in politics is understudied. So I think since time is running out and we don't want to stand between you and the discussion, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor, for inviting me here. It's not my first time to Baden-Württemberg, which I know perfectly well. My husband comes from Heiden, but first time to Heidelberg. Sure. And I'm very happy to share some of my research with you. As Professor said, I'm from Jagiellonian University in Krakow. I've been doing research in South Asia for the last almost 20 years. And I visited Pakistan many times, also India. In Pakistan, I've been 8 times doing research. I visited all provinces and Pakistani administered Kashmir as well. Did some research on Kashmir issue, and my PhD was on Kashmir, which I studied, the problem both from Indian and Pakistani side, which resulted in 3 books published by Routledge in 22, the co-authored books, and I teach right now about India in foreign policy in the 21st century and strategic cultures of Asian states, among others. And this is part of my research that I've done in cooperation with my colleagues, the research on emotions, critical emotion studies, which is part of the book that's going to be published hopefully next year. And we focus on different countries, different regions. I focus on Pakistan because I thought that it's a very interesting case study. Emotional responses in Pakistani politics to the liberal world order and democratic values. We focus on emotions and democratic backsliding, how it correlates, and how different regimes, countries perceive liberal world order, democratic values, and what role it plays in evoking emotions and politicizing emotions, like the policy of intentional politicizing emotions in the internal narratives of different governments, different countries. So my today's presentation will be divided into 5 parts, hypotheses. Of course, this is just a sample of the research. It deserves to be a separate lecture studying emotions in different countries and in South Asia in particular, and also in Pakistan. You could talk about different regions in Pakistan and how certain things are emotionalized with regards to local policies in different provinces. So then this is just like a little sample of the research. I will focus on things that I can talk about within an hour. And I will present the research questions, some framework, emotions as a historical heritage, because you need to study history to understand emotions and the way they are used as part of the intentionally crafted narratives. I will illustrate emotional responses. We present these two pillars of analysis that I introduced in my research. Brief conclusion, I hope there will be some time. So for sure, we have Pakistan, which is located in South Asia. You know everything about it. It's a nuclear power, it's a Praetorian state, like a hybrid regime in which the military establishment wields significant power beyond the traditional role that army should play in the country. And it directly influences policy making. So this obviously has a role in contribution to the perpetual political turmoil, immense socio-economic challenges in Pakistan. So this injustice, the way Pakistan was established, I don't want to go too much into history because I would spend an hour talking about how and why Pakistan was established. But this deep-rooted fear of domination by the Hindu majority in India, if Pakistan was not established, it was from the beginning based on emotions. They are ingrained. I mean, emotions are everywhere. In Poland, you also have emotions toward Germany, for example, that were politicized and used by the former regime of peace to demand reparation. And that was highly emotional issue, using history to pursue divisive populist narratives, right? So this is not just the case of Pakistan. So they are ingrained in political culture of Pakistan, contributing directly to shaping certain narratives. So political heritage and hybridity when it comes to the political system of Pakistan. We have the army, which is not directly in power right now. In theory, we have a civilian government, but in fact, it is the army which is responsible for shaping the domestic and foreign policy of the country, in fact. So this is like a very interesting mix of emotions, ideology, and we also have to add what we refer to as majoritarianism, the majoritarian nationalism ideology based on Islam, which is supposed to play a fundamental role in shaping the country and its policies and its society. So just a few research questions. I will focus on these three of these critical emotion studies, how emotions shape, how they constitute emotions. It allows us to understand these, how emotions travel, I would say, across post-colonial geographies. That's why I think it's very important to focus on different case studies in different regions. So who constructs this discourse of liberal, how it is responded, how democratic values are used in different declarations, different narratives, and why, how this process fluctuates, because it fluctuates in relation to the historically inherited political ideological specificity of Pakistan, and how, to what extent these emotions affect worldviews, they fuel populism, what is the connotation, how do they contribute to challenging democratic values and shaping or reshaping the political landscape in Pakistan. There is a lot of research. I just leave certain examples here that I mentioned in my work, but what I want to emphasize right now, research on emotions in IR, in international relations, that I do introduce certain concepts in my work, emotional interpretation of international affairs and the politics of affective exclusion. And around these two concepts, I try to to formulate my thoughts and pursue the analysis. So how I try to exemplify, and I give certain examples of emotionalization of political narratives. So emotions, when I talk about emotions as historical heritage, and it always reminds me of a certain event that happens every day at the Wada border, Wada-Atari border. You know what happens there? What? Yes.
There's,
Yeah, please. Yeah, because you raise your hand, so please.
there's like two ceremonies at each side where they have like kind of half a stadium built with spectators, and in the middle of the military performs like dances and patrol simulations and stuff, like show of force, I guess.
On both sides of the border, there's this flag lowering ceremony. Has anyone attended it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've attended on Indian and Pakistani side, and these are the photos I took. I mean, funny, but at the same time, it speaks volumes about the approach, yeah, the emotion. They are just, you know, showing themselves to India. These guys are like 2 meters tall, you know, the fittest, the strongest, they march, and this also shows these emotions on both sides. They replicate, they have to discuss what to do. So they prepare the entire show in cooperation. And when there is a celebration or certain feast or whatever, they exchange sweets, for example. Yeah, so some people criticize it as like some post-colonial circus, some enjoy. Obviously, the people behind, you can see how they enjoy the show, how they enjoy shouting Pakistan Zindabad, and on other side India, Hindustan, yeah. So this is like the same, it shows these emotions, and these emotions are intentionally crafted. I mean, in Pakistan, since its inception, because of the sense of threat, of the domination, of the two-nation theory that was created with one purpose, to establish a separate state. I will refer to it more in a minute. Oh, here how they just show to the Indians. Yeah, we are so strong, powerful. So these are the emotions. For sure, the geographic location of Pakistan, I think I don't have to go into this much. It's challenging, obviously, with the protracted conflict with India, but now the Afghanistan Taliban regime, with interactions with China, that is also a very important part of the way Pakistan constructs its policies and shapes its discourse over democracy. The two-nation theory that we have two nations, yeah, religion somehow is a decisive element of to which nation you belong. So that was deeply emotional factor. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, you know, probably he was a gentleman educated in the West who spoke Urdu with the English accent. When he spoke Pakistan Zindabad, it would sound like Pakistan's in the back. People were laughing. And this guy, who looked like a Western gentleman, created a state that was supposed to be based on Islam. So Islam was like a factor which shaped the nation, the new nation of people consisting, coming from different regions. Coming from India, from, for example, Mumbai or other cities, who settled, for example, in Sindh province, and they were complete newcomers to a different culture. So this nation, the process of shaping a nation was a very challenging task, and it had a very emotional factor in it. This political heritage comes from the colonial, post-colonial era, the communal violence. The history is used, the heritage of partition, which is also interpreted and used as a tool introduced in the education system to show that India will always remain, always be an enemy. And you should never trust the Hindus. And that was used throughout the history of Pakistan many times. For example, even when Bangladesh, there was this Bengal war and crisis, the Bengali people were also perceived or projected as Hindus. those who are now the real citizens of Pakistan. So there was the entire emotionally strengthened narrative against certain groups of people, which continues till today in Pakistan. So traumatic experiences, the difficult or deepened feelings of distrust. So it has this religious connotation, which is, of course, the oversimplification, of course, there is no doubt. But this is how it's intentionally constructed, that you should see a person who is a Hindu as your enemy, or a person who belongs to minority within Pakistan, like Ahmadiyya community, or even Shia community within Pakistan as well. All these issues that are related to the slogan of Islam in danger, that is an emanation of Muslim separatism, nationalism, and is used in Pakistan right now when these elements are combined with the necessity to defend the country because of the potential threat from India. So the army, the Pakistani flag, the guardians of peace, it's always been there as part of the narrative, and a factor that contributed to the lack of development of democratic institutions. Of course, there was also a foreign factor, which I will mention, cooperation with the United States. But if we look at history, we should just remember that the first Independence Day, Pakistan celebrated on the 15th of August. This is the stamp that commemorates the event. Only later, Pakistan did not want to have the same celebration as India. Yeah, so that's why they changed it. But the first stamp commemorating the event is showing clearly that it is the 15th of August, 47. And I studied some textbooks in Pakistan. I can share if somebody is interested more. This one is the most famous. And when I was in Pakistan in 2018, 2019, my friend showed me, look, this is for my son. This is the Pakistan Studies, and my son is studying from this book. A very interesting textbook which shows profound impact of emotions and interpretation of history. I just show one page here, which it's just changing the history to the needs of the day. That in Indian subcontinent, every individual who embraced Islam associated himself socially and politically to the Muslim society and said, this is not true. So why do we have 200 million Muslims in India? Not everybody wanted to leave India and settle in Pakistan when Pakistan was created. Even some Muslim leaders were against establishing Pakistan. So that is not true. This is a very divisive and emotional strategy. Every Muslim was supporting the idea of Pakistan. And it was entirely different from that of the other Indian nations, the identity based on two-nation theory. So two major nations. So being part of the religion makes you a person who belongs to the nation. They were entirely different from each other, religions, religious ideas, the way of living, everything was different. That's why Pakistan was created. This is obviously not true, and it does not represent what really happened in history. And another example, when I was in Army Museum in Lahore, they show, when you go to the museum, when you read a textbook, you believe what is being written there. And many scholars that the research on South Asia emphasize the role of the education system, how you shape the attitudes. Not every parent, all parents have the knowledge about the history and are able to teach their children the reality and how it really looks like. So what you read in textbooks, when you go to the museum, what you see there, you tend to believe. So Alexander's invasion of Pakistan. Yeah, it's not so much. Yeah, what do you think about it?
Alexander the Great.
Yeah, Alexander the Great invasion of Pakistan. Yeah, so they give this impression that Pakistan existed forever. It was there, yeah. So after capturing Iran, Egypt, and Afghanistan, Alexander invaded Pakistan in 327 BC. So what image do you have from this? Yeah, that we are, we've always been there. it was just India who pretended that it was not Pakistan. So this is how you just shape the history and evoke certain emotions. And this is all part and parcel of majoritarianism. When we discuss majoritarian, religiously motivated approach, we tend to focus on India. Or right now, especially after Narendra Modi came to power, last decade, we've been dealing with strengthening of such approach, Hindu nationalism, which is nothing new in India. It has been there before, but it has been strengthened tremendously in the last decade. But we also have to emphasize that majoritarian Muslim, or Islamic nationalism was there as part of the reason why Pakistan was established. So it is, of course, challenging to define this term, but the Muslim interest, the ideology that promotes the authoritarian and populist style of rule. So there is a deep correlation between majoritarian nationalism. You have to explain to people, you have to give them this conviction that, yeah, we need the majority rule because we were established in the name of Islam. So if you do not agree with this strategy, you're against Islam, you're anti-Pakistan. This is how the enemies of the state are projected, are presented. And this source of identities, as I said, characteristic feature of the BJP-led India, the Iran Shia ideology, which also does not represent the reality in Iran. So these pillars, the emotional interpretation. So first we go beyond Pakistan and we try to look at the way international affairs are interpreted. And I just give a few examples here that I focus on deeply in the research. So how current international dynamics is being used to legitimize certain worldview, yeah, and to strengthen this worldview among the citizens. So, for example, here, this is a photo taken by my colleague, Agnieszka in Pakistan recently. As you can see, in support of Palestine against Israel, one more Holocaust needed. And if you would ask these people, probably they would not even be able that much to explain what Holocaust was. But they don't know enough what it ended up with and what was the reason of Holocaust. But they are convinced by the populist leadership, some of the religious parties, Jamaat Islami, for example, they are like spreading this sort of narrative, anti-Israel narrative, pro-Palestine narrative, by using the fact that Pakistan projects itself as a country which should defend Muslims across the world, since it was the country shaped for the Muslims from Indian subcontinent, or from in British India, let's say. So this is this declarative sort of approach that we should, but if, of course it's selective, I will add it in a minute. So the Afghanistan issue, the 9/11, yeah, the relations with the United States, very important, as I've already mentioned. These relations have directly contributed to the radicalization in the region and in Pakistan. And of course, Palestinians, the Middle East conflict, how it's projected, the pro-Palestine, the anti-Israel. I think you cannot enter Israel even with Pakistani passport, and it's just not recognized as a country, as a sovereign country. Even if I wanted to enter Israel, I think I have so many Pakistani visas that in Iranian visas, so have even problems with in the United States with Iranian visas right now. So this is how the world is divided, yeah, unfortunately. And then we have this concept of freedom, azad, yeah, propagated by Islamist groups. But on the other hand, the Islamic ideology is not per se, it has nothing to do with freedom, right? But it's used, this word like Azad, Jammu and Kashmir, for example. This is how they refer to the part of Kashmir, that former princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, which is now administered by Pakistan, Azad Jammu and Kashmir, and then we have Gilgit-Baltistan Azad, because it was liberated shortly after partition. This is where the Pashto tribes, supported by Pakistani army, managed to enter and conquer, control the region. So that's why it's Azad. So even in the name, there is this ideology and emotions. Yeah, this is the free part of Kashmir, contrary to the one on the other side of the line of control, the de facto border, which divides two parts of Kashmir between India and Pakistan. So defender of Muslims' rights, but again, we should ask the question. Is it really like so? Because the focus is on Kashmiris, in particular Kashmiri Muslims from the Kashmir Valley, the Sunnis, and Palestinians. But not much has been said about Uyghurs in China because of the higher than Himalaya, deeper than oceans, and sweeter than sugar friendship. Yeah, so you don't talk about Uyghurs and their human rights violations, although they are subjected to massive systemic and systematical violations by China. And I will also focus on, in a minute, on Afghani Muslims in Pakistan, because there is also a domestic internal campaign against them. So then we have these issues combined together, and they are used to criticize the West, Western hypocrisy, when it comes to Palestine issue, when it comes to the Middle East conflict, when it comes to the relations with the United States, which are to be blamed also for the entire situation. I just briefly emphasize these strategic interests that somehow connected Pakistan with the United States, due to geostrategic issues. When Pakistan was established, it was good to cooperate with Pakistan during the Cold War. So then the frontline state, and this is being repeated by Pakistani authorities, we are the frontline state. We suffer and we need support. But from the American perspective, it was like, whatever, whoever is in power, be it a dictator like Ziaul Haq, the worst dictator in the history of Pakistan, who significantly contributed to radicalization processes, which seem to be right now quite irreversible, but the Americans supported him. And then all other military dictators. So our dictator, good dictator, the state within a state, benefits for the narrow military establishments that somehow shaped this establishment as gave it a role of the major political actor within Pakistan, and profits from the strategic cooperation with the United States. In the US in the 70s and 80s, we had the major right-wing turn in the policy of Washington. This was exemplified by the reaction to the invasion of the Soviet Union of Afghanistan, the support for Mujahideen, which were courted by the Republicans in the United States. This paved the way to the radicalization in Pakistan, support for the ISI and selected Islamic outfits that were supposed to fight in Afghanistan. And the result, we know, the radical Islamization and further weakening of democratic norms and strategies in Afghanistan. So we could say that the Cold War strategy of the United States is partially to be blamed for this situation in Afghanistan. And then when the war in Afghanistan ended, the Soviet Union collapsed, then these fighters were used in Kashmir. That's why the anti-India insurgency escalated massively in the early 90s. And this policy was continued. The support for Kashmir, it's always there. Wherever any Pakistani politician gives a talk about whatever topic, he will for sure say at least one sentence about Kashmir. But when they talk about Kashmir, it's only about Indian part of Kashmir. And so all human rights violations take place in India. And to some extent, I would say that Pakistani diplomacy succeeded. Because when I talk to my students or I have lectures elsewhere, talk about Kashmir, so they focus on Kashmir in India. So in this regard, Pakistan managed to divert attention from its own human rights challenges, violations in the part of Pakistan it administers to India. To some extent, that was at some time a successful campaign, but I think I would not say it is anymore. But yeah, this strategy towards Kashmir, it's very emotional. The Kashmir issue, it's children are taught from the early ages that India occupies Kashmir and the worst of the worst human rights violations take place. And whatever policy India introduces, it's always, there's always a reaction. In Pakistan, for example, in 2019, when Jammu and Kashmir was transformed into a union territory, and Article 370 was revoked from Indian constitution, there was a massive reaction in Pakistan that India is committing human rights violations and so on. So this also helps the establishment to project India as the greatest enemy. So that there is this focus on Kashmir issue, and it's all combined somehow. There is a correlation between the interactions between Pakistan and the United States, and the Afghanistan and Kashmir policy of the Pakistani leadership. Of course, these relations and support from the United States had a profound impact on Pakistan's internal situation, allowed the military to pursue its goals, turn Pakistan into dependent on foreign aid, and it also contributed to the perpetuation of inequalities. So then the politics of effective exclusion, where emotions are also used to, like they are stirred up to attack the opponents. This is a deliberate aim. Those who are against the state are the enemies of the state, minorities, like religious minorities, other vulnerable groups. So there is the legal institutional support for these for this exclusion, and the entire process and the aim is just to ensure that powerful actors, the state within the state, the religious leaders who have also cooperated with the establishment, both military and civilian establishment, because the civilian establishment is also to be blamed for this situation, compromising and cooperating with the military dictators. So this is the process that is aimed to maintain the power of these actors, a lasting control over Pakistan, over its resources, over the domestic and foreign discourse of Pakistan. So there is a deeply emotional reference, like the former Prime Minister Imran Khan, who called the liberals come, finance. It's always this campaign of being financed by the United States. So United States has some issues and they want to impact the internal policy in Pakistan. So that's why they finance these liberals, these who are the enemies, who are against our traditions. Imran Khan had even this nickname, Taliban Khan, financing some madrasas in the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province. And he was elevated to power by the army, and also the army contributed to the fact that he lost his power, like other leaders before him. And then we have these imaginary threats, the constant threats to Pakistan from the opponents of Islam, that, for example, religious parties are openly denouncing Western values. Western values are not something that we want in the country. They are destroying our culture. And we absolutely have to get rid of every liberal living in Pakistan. So, sorry, this should be anti-refugee rhetorics, for example, against Afghani refugees. So Muslims are also victims of this strategy. Recently, a year ago, the government has introduced this strategy of getting rid of Afghani refugees. They were forced to move to the country, ruled by the Taliban, the country many of these people do not even know. So there is a campaign, a very strong campaign, because we need to get rid of them. They have to go back to Afghanistan. it's part of the Afghanistan-Pakistan conflict as well. And then we have the second level outright threats, like in Balochistan, for example, enforced disappearances, all these human rights violations that we read about in other regions, silencing the opponents, restricting their rights, teaching them a lesson. So they are subjected to, for example, enforced disappearances, then they come back after a while, but they are taught the lesson. So they should not talk, for example, about certain fragile issues such as Balochistan, which is a topic for another discussion. And it does not help them. And then we have the direct deadly violence, the concrete actions against certain people who are regarded as a threat by the regime, by the government, like people whom I knew personally, Sabine Mahmoud, who organized in Karachi, she organized a talk about Balochistan, and then she was killed. I think it was April 2015, as far as I remember. Amjad Sabri, those people who are regarded as, they talk about the issues they should not, they are too westernized, they think that freedom of speech is part and parcel of our culture, which it should not be. So these people are physically exterminated. Amjad Sabri was a musician, member of the wonderful bands, Sabri Brothers, who visited Warsaw, I remember, in 2012. And I also met them in Pakistan. That was really a very sad and emotional event that when he and Sabine were killed. So direct deadly violence. Human rights activists are always threatened as well in different regions of Pakistan. And minorities, different mob attacks supported by local religious leaders, by accusations, but so the laws that are there, like blasphemy law, are selectively used against people who are perceived as danger, not only against the minorities, of course, but for sure, some Christian minorities, for example, accused of burning the Quran or other acts against Islam. The Asia Bibi case that in the West we've heard about it. She spent almost 10 years in prison because of blasphemy. And mob attacks, like certain legal provisions that enable the marginalization of non-Muslims and Muslims like Shias, Ahmadis, who are regarded non-Muslims by Pakistani constitution and Pakistani law. So you can imagine how the persecution of these people escalated when they were declared non-Muslims. So an ideologization of education, which contributes to the radicalization of middle class. I gave you the example. So these Western values should be regarded as concern. They are not our values. And the West has always certain interest, which is not far from the truth, of course, but it is projected, it is presented in the way that the Western values are not the values that we should embrace, which has a direct impact on how people perceive minorities and freedom. That leads to attacks. There are different examples here against minorities, like Godhra riots, like the colony attack in 2013 in Lahore, and so on, and blasphemy accusations that happen quite, I would say, regularly. So the short conclusion, yes, for sure, we should say that the political, religious, military leadership is actively engaged in politicization of emotions and formulation of how we should respond to democratic values, to the liberal world order. The word hypocrisy is repeated. The Western world is hypocritical in its approach towards the right, towards democracy. We do not want this here. It's a major narrative. This is how it sounds. And of course, this interpretation has a major impact, very profound impact on domestic, on regional interactions, on the way Pakistan wants to project itself. And for sure, there is a China aspect, which I did not mention too much, but for sure, we could assume that many different projects that are introduced by China, including, I did a separate research on the China-Pakistan economic corridor. I can share the article with you if you want. It also has an impact on democratic backsliding in Pakistan, because we can assume that China would not support democratic governments in the countries that are part or perceived as China's friends, and Pakistan is one of them for sure in the region. And there is a deep economic cooperation, political cooperation, academic cooperation. I received many PhDs from Chinese students who studied in China, in Pakistan. So I would spend another hour to discuss the multidimensional interactions, cultural, economic, social, political, security related between Pakistan and China. If you look at C3 reports, the Stockholm Institute, for sure you analyze these reports for peace research, and then you have the data, who buys weapons from whom, and then you can see how Pakistan is dependent on China in this regard as well. So for sure, it also has impact how Pakistan projects itself and what role Pakistan will play in the region in the foreseeable future. And it has also an impact on perception of Western liberal democracy. But the interesting things is that autocrats would always say and use or abuse the word democracy. Yeah, they would always emphasize, we are a democratic country, we cherish democracy. So this democracy is always typically a good connotation. Even the chief of army staff, General Munir, he said following the last elections, polarization, which does not suit a progressive country of 250 million. So we do not support it. He urged politicians to make democracy functional and purposeful. Yeah, he urged politicians, make democracy functional. Pakistan's diverse polity and pluralism will be well represented by a unified government of all democratic forces in life within national purpose. So you see all these declarations of nice they sound, but they have not so much to do with reality. So this is the politicization of religion, which is part and parcel of emotional discourse within Pakistan. It's like a unifying tool. It has to evoke emotions related to this national identity, that we are this group of the people we have to defend. We are always in this defensive position. And it has to be part of our domestic and foreign policy objectives aimed at defeating the enemies within the country and beyond Pakistan. The evident emphasis on Islamophobia, this is again used in the narratives towards the West, challenges faced by Kashmiri Muslims and Palestinians, Rohingyas also sometimes. And these two elements, the emotional interpretation of international affairs, politics of effective exclusion, they serve to ensure that Pakistan and its society will not deviate from the post-colonial, because this is a post-colonial approach. We are always a victim. We need strong religion to shape the policy within the country. We need majoritarianism and a very hard nationalism, because otherwise we will not be able to exist. So that this post-colonial discourse of victimhood is always there, unfortunately. And this has an effect. The combination of disdain for democratic processes and the perpetuation of undemocratic governance which in turn obviously hinders the development of democratic institutions. And there are various domestic factors and also international factors that seem to contribute to this strategy. Thank you so much for now, and I'm open for discussion and questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think. Well timed, despite the fact that we had some technical glitches. Yes, Hossein, if you can also identify yourself before, because I will not be able to identify some people.
Here's my email if anyone wants to contact me.
Yeah. Yes, Hossein, I think you have a question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because of presentation, just a question regarding what is emotional rationality of presentation? Because now we could see that you explain Pakistan's foreign policy based on emotion, but the implicit assumption was that we have also rationality. So there is a kind of a polar understanding, okay, it is mostly based on emotional
Yeah.
decision making. Or
Yeah.
So what
Emotions,
is actually here?
yeah,
So this
the,
is number one.
uh-huh.
Number two, when again look at it to rational choice, explanation of international law, and just look at the point that you raised about existential threat. You talked about, okay, Pakistan feels existential threats from for example, Hindus, Hindu majority. So, when you're talking about rational theories, what is the maximum interest to protect yourself?
Mhm.
So, forget all of those emotional, cultural, normative aspects. Very basic definition here, we have existential threat from other players. I'm just asking this question to pose you to
Yeah.
alternative
Yeah, I
explanation.
understand. Mhm.
So again, let's also bring it to Indo-Pakistan nuclear issue.
Mhm.
So there, actually, we can see here textbook example of those rational calculation. The decline of the level of the conflict after the test based on MED. So my point here is, where is the rational theory of explanation? Is it something only related to the Western democratic rational players? Or no, we can find. And but can we really leave this kind of dichotomy? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Should I reply now or?
Yeah, I don't see any other questions. Is there a related question or is it a different?
Different.
Yeah, then I think we should take it.
So we should ask about the real threat. Is Pakistan really threatened by India? Is it within India's interest to destroy Pakistan, to use nuclear weapons against Pakistan? Or this is just lack of rationality and the purpose of using these emotions to stay in power in Pakistan's policies? The nuclear aspect, it did not sufficiently remove the risk of the conventional wars. We had conventional crisis in the relations between India and Pakistan after the nuclearization of bilateral relations. But at the same time, I would say that in Pakistani emotional policies, the aspect or the factor of India has always been exaggerated. I mean, it is not within the interest of India to start a war on the Indian subcontinent. Even China doesn't want it. China wants the conflict between India and Pakistan to be there because it allows China to control part of Kashmir as well, Aksai Chin, Shaksam Valley, which was given by Pakistan in '63. But nobody, in fact, wants an open armed conflict in Indian subcontinent. The threat from India was used as a political tool in Pakistan, and it has been used like since the inception of the country. And this strategy, I would say, is deeply irrational. There is no rationality in this approach. India is not, I would not say that India is interested in controlling Pakistan and like admitting 250 million Muslims in India. This is not something that Pakistan should perceive as a threat. But it was a convenient strategy to strengthen or to have this image that the army should play a major political role because the army is a source of security within Pakistan. So it elevated the role of the military establishment, this sort of strategy towards India and perception of India as the enemy, because the goal was achieved, right? The country for the Muslims, how it was projected, was established. And that was it. But nonetheless, what we deal with in South Asia, especially right now, of course, with Narendra Modi in power, is that I would even ask the question if South Asia really exists as a region, just geographically, because Pakistan is turning away from, South Asian history, traditions, culture, towards Islamization, cooperation with China, with some external forces, and two major countries of the region are not cooperating with each other. And these countries are responsible for improving the situation and strengthening regional cooperation. The SAARC organization with its headquarters, I visited in Kathmandu last year, it's not active. Let's say in the region, it's like a paper tiger because of this. These majoritarian nationalism that are now clashing. Yeah, that it developed in Pakistan earlier, and now it's gradually also developing in India. But India is not only like focused on Pakistan, on different other. India has more global aspirations.
Yes, Professor Mitra. Thank you very much for a very wide-ranging talk. I've heard things today from you which I've never heard before. For example, Alexander the Great's invasion of Pakistan.
Again, which one?
I had not heard about it.
Alexander
I always thought
Oh, yeah. The
I always
museum,
thought he
yeah.
invaded India.
The Lahore
So,
Art Museum.
Yeah, like Pakistan claiming back so ancient roots. Very nice
Yeah.
formulation. Similarly, post-colonial victimhood, very nice, very nice formulation. It's always somebody else's fault, isn't it?
Yeah, of course.
So, but that's not what my question is about. My question is about how to formalize and measure what you call emotions. Because if you don't do that, it becomes everything. Since you're familiar with Germany,
Yeah.
it will be an Alle Heil Bitte.
Sure, absolutely.
Some people got emotional, they split India, they made Pakistan. Then some other people got emotional and they split Pakistan again, made Bangladesh.
Mhm.
And some are getting even more emotional, they want a separate Balochistan.
Mhm.
So it's kind of an invasion variable,
Mhm.
if it is a variable.
Yeah.
So how does one measure what you call emotions?
Mhm.
I would go to the theatre state of Clifford Geertz and talk about Balinese cockfights, for example.
Mhm.
That's one way.
Mhm.
Or in other words, it's a first level approximation of a phenomenon. If you dig deeper, there will be others. For example, Sudhir Kakar has a variable called chosen trauma.
Mhm.
If you dig deeper, you would understand why communal riots become suddenly so very violent.
Yeah.
So that's the methodological question. How does one measure emotion so that one can give it the weight it has to
Yeah.
in a model which explains politics? Does it supplement gender, class, caste, identity, ethnicity, or does it subsume them all?
Yeah, it seems to subsume them all because of this, I would say, artificially created and imposed vision of nationhood. So therefore, I traveled in Pakistan and I had some interviews also with some scholars, human rights activists for sure. And I tried to find out how and what is the role of emotions in the processes of gradual democratic backsliding in Pakistan. And of course, this is a huge challenge, how to measure and how to provide an answer to this question, what is the role of these emotions and how they are perceived. I think that it can be measured like region-wise, of course, and different emotions in different regions. The situation will be different in Balochistan, for example. It will be different in Gilgit-Baltistan, but this is the maybe some future study that if possible. But on the other hand, it's also difficult to have some surveys in such regions because people would tend to answer the questions they are supposed to answer, not what they really think. So therefore, it's a very challenging task, especially for a Western scholar or anyone from the outside who comes to these closed societies living in very repressive environments. So therefore, maybe you will never have the real and one answer to this question. You can always only recognize the problems, trace the history, what are the concrete decisions, like in the legal aspects within Pakistan, which I also give certain examples here, and how they impact the living conditions of minorities. So this is the way it was analyzed, and how these events are interpreted. And for example, in these history textbooks or Pakistan studies, how the history is distorted. Many authors, Professor Footboy, for example, was writing about the interpretation of history, and I always emphasize that the education system has a major impact on how social attitudes are shaped. And if you say education, people are educated, but what does it mean? How they are educated? What is the role of ideology and interpretation of history on shaping the attitudes of people? Another aspect which I'm yet to study is the impact of social media on polarizing the attitudes. I think this is tremendously important right now. On evoking emotions, because social media is very, very emotional. There's this emotional component ingrained in it, and it only escalates certain attitudes.
Yes, may I ask let me push you a little further, because I think you put your finger on a very, very important phenomenon. Who gets emotional and why?
Yeah.
I'm thinking on my feet. I don't work in this field, but you are working on it. So I thought I'll give you an idea which you might want to explore further. Could it be that at a given context, somebody gets emotional because she has an argument which cannot be registered in terms of the variables that other people are working with?
Yeah.
For example, take Jinnah, good, trained, rational lawyer, but his rationality is not getting him far enough. The Congress swallows would not give him the job he would like to.
Yeah.
So rationally, he finds something else which gives him what he wants. Or in other words, his emotions come as a last weapon of the underdog. If you take this idea, you would see why there is suicide terrorism. I mean, you can push it further. So try to link emotions to the underdog, which is actually the argument of Clifford Geertz. Why do people go to cockfights? Because they have no fight left. They're Hindus. They're Balinese in an Islamic state, Islamic society. So they let the cocks do the fighting, just like in the Wagah border. So try to think of a felt need, an underdog, nothing else is available. So you fall back on that residual thing called emotions.
Sure, absolutely. And it's also here in Germany, the underdog self-perception, which gives AfD power in Thüringen, for example, in some villages or other parts of mostly Eastern Germany. I want more, but I cannot achieve it. Therefore, I will join this group, which will do it for me. And I think this is strictly based on emotions and self-perception. And then the underdog is good, I think, idea here.
You remember a shipyard worker for Lech Walesa
Yeah.
when you were starting out?
Yeah, exactly. And we could do the comparative analysis and find many common issues.
Yeah.
In Poland, confederation may be in power in the next elections. This is worse than peace. They are based on outright aggressive nationalism. Again, especially, I mean, there is many issues there, and then I
Jinnah was also a little confused.
yeah, Jinnah was for sure a little
Because he
confused.
did tell Nehru to keep his house in Bombay.
Yeah, exactly.
And he was not planning his retirement in Lahore.
I think
So,
he underestimated this
And
ambitions.
the question is what Pakistan would have been if Jinnah had survived a little bit longer. than
This
he
is
did.
always the question.
But I think the questions that I think both Hussain and Professor Mitra have raised, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to comment right now. I think they lead you in the direction of thinking more systematically about emotions.
Mhm.
And even perhaps pursue your argument in that direction.
Mhm.
Yes, Amelia, you have a question.
This one, thank you, ma'am, for such an expansive and comprehensive presentation. My question is regarding, there was one particular subtopic, the Pakistan-US interest, the geostrategic issues. So how to actually define Pakistan as a cyclical frontline state? And secondly, as a follow-up question regarding the regime configuration, in a Laswellian sense, is it a Praetorian state considering the civil-military relations, or is it like a garrison state, considering the language of securitization and the arrogation
Yeah.
of arms?
Yeah, there are different expressions. Some say it's a garrison state, some say it's a country, it's like a hybrid. I think the hybrid is the word here. That is ruled both by the military establishment and the civilian establishment, but civilian establishment has always compromised. Whatever leader, whoever you can see, be it Nawaz Sharif or other leaders, they were elevated to power with the support of the military establishment, and this policy was introduced after, like since 1958, let's say, with the first military regime of Ayub Khan, who was a Democrat, who was a westernized guy. He had friends all over the world. He was, I think, educated in Britain. Yeah, so he was supported by Americans because they perceived Pakistan. This is American, this is a post-colonial perception of Pakistan, frontline state. And unfortunately, Pakistani authorities happily took this expression. Yeah, this is the post-colonial policy. And many people in Pakistan, they emphasize, these leaders, they, to a large extent, they replicate the post-colonial way of exercising power within the country. So the frontline state, this is not the perception that you would expect from an independent South Asian country. This is the approach which was established by the United States. It's a frontline state in our Cold War rivalry with the Soviet Union. But then Afghanistan issue, terrible. I feel so sorry for my Afghani friends. Some of them escaped to Germany, some to Poland. The situation it's a topic for another discussion. Yeah, with the Afghanistan issue, that of course did not end in 1989. It continued with another war. So this is the frontline state, the Afghan border, it was politicized and projected by the American narratives, especially during the invasion of Afghanistan, which lasted for 20 years. It has nothing to do with war and terror. It was just the projection of power, unfortunately. In the frontline state, so Pakistani army that cooperates, ISI and CIA cooperation, dates back to the 50s, after the inception of Pakistan. Pakistan was regarded as an important player by Americans because India wanted different strategy, like being more independent. So even though the West tried to cooperate with India. And in Pakistan, there is this approach that, oh, if India wanted, the West would always choose India. But India had different, Jawaharlal Nehru had different strategy. He also admired Soviet Union, especially its economy. He chose different paths, and Pakistan was regarded as an important. At the time, it was Iran. It was ruled by Pahlavi dynasty, and Pakistan as important players in these regional strategies against the Soviet. So there was the Soviet paranoia, which was also supported, unfortunately, by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was one of the architects of this strategy. Everything, we have to do everything, but the Soviets are the most dangerous. So let's give power to Mujahideen, let's pump money with Saudi Arabia, let's establish madrasas and whatever. They have to fight against the Soviet Union. And then we have the result of these strategies. So frontline state, this is the Western construct, which was adopted by Pakistani decision makers, primarily by the military establishment. And it's a post-colonial construct, I would say. I don't know if Professor agrees or.
Can we take a couple of questions
Yeah,
together?
yeah, sure.
Yes, Mir.
Hello, Professor. My name is Mia. Short name, I'm from Bangladesh.
Wonderful.
And I'm really glad that I'm here to listen to your lecture because I have learned something new from you regarding Bangladesh. Because we have studied and known that how Bengalis or East Bengal under
Yeah,
Pakistan have struggled
Yeah,
against discrimination,
Yes,
discrimination in
yes.
economic discrimination, cultural discrimination, all kinds of discrimination.
Yeah.
But today you just told that Bengalis were also seen as Hindus,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
others,
Yeah,
like enemy.
yeah,
But from my learning from students from Pakistan
Yeah.
who came to study here, from their presentations, I have learned that in the Pakistani textbook,
yeah.
the separation of Bangladesh was seen as a fall of Bengal due to India's
Oh,
intervention.
of course.
Not because Bengalis
Yeah,
were
yeah, yeah.
struggling for
Yeah,
their
yeah, yeah,
own economic emancipation.
Yeah.
And so that's how they learned in their textbook that they have lost their one part
Yeah,
of their brotherhood.
Because of India.
Yes. But today, in the political change in Bangladesh,
Yeah.
in the context of this government, Jamaat-e-Islami is now in better power position. And because now the students who were actually fighting in Bangladesh for
Yeah,
anti-discriminatory policies, and in this context, Pakistan wants to help Bangladesh now, because they wanted to also support in the process of discrimination in the country, like in Bangladesh. But the question is, there are like 3.5 million Bengalis in Karachi living ever since the Bangladesh's separation. It's already so many years. And these 3.5 million Bengalis who live in Karachi in ghettos, they have not given basic rights. They can't go to school, they can't go to participate in mainstream jobs or higher education. They are always seen as kind of threat of Pakistan's security. So the idea, like they are trying to help now in Bangladesh to eliminate discrimination, whereby there is a perpetual discrimination of Bengalis who are living in Pakistan. So
Yeah.
this is my logic, I don't understand.
Yeah, but the similar logic is towards Afghanistan. On the one hand, they were supporting the Taliban regime, but at the same time persecuting their own Afghani refugees who live in Pakistan for decades. And you gave the wonderful example of one-sided interpretation of history. It's always India. And I also heard it from PhD students from Pakistan that this is what they learned, that India was responsible for the breakup of Pakistan, that the Eastern Wing became independent, and India supported this struggle. Whereas this is not true, obviously, because the Eastern Wing was always neglected, marginalized, and its resources were used by the mainland Pakistan. Even in the army, the Bengalis were not represented. And during the 1970 elections, Bengalis should have the prime minister. Mujibur Rahman should have become a prime minister of Pakistan. But then there was a nice cooperation between Bhuttos and the army, who were not interested how come Bengalis will. And if this democratic process was introduced, the history would be totally different, right? So you're absolutely right. The history is being used, and this is only declarative issues that are pursued by Pakistani authorities. Maybe they want to have an impact on internal policy of Bangladesh.
So this is a very timely question because
Yeah.
before we move on to the next question, and we really want to collect all the questions, we actually screened Sham Benegal's
Yeah.
now famous or infamous feature film on Sheikh Mujib last Saturday at night. And we had a good discussion. We had a couple of Bangladeshis, including Dr. Mustafizur Rahman, in the audience. And we try to delineate both the myth and the objective facts that are well known in history.
Yeah.
And we came to the conclusion that there were deviations from historical representation, but the general storyline was fine, and that it was actually not a bad feature film. It was a good feature film. So Sham Benegal certainly performed the task that Sheikh Hasina had given him. It was not a boring movie.
Bangladesh is
But,
also an interesting case study, and I think the country which is very often neglected in the general study of South Asia, which is mostly focused on India, Pakistan, and sometimes Afghanistan.
So I think we move to Humble, and then Anish, you have a
Yeah.
question? Those will be the last two. Or you, then quickly, let's take collective.
Thank you, Doctor, for your work on Pakistan. One thing I would agree that Pakistan is definitely portrayed as a teleological end. While growing up in Pakistan, that was always considered a given. And my question is like basically about how much have these emotions has played in the rational decision making of the state. I mean, if we will leave like a foreign policy, and if we talk about the internal state, we see a lot of ideological state institutions, we see a lot of role of clerics, and not that much of scientists and not at all actually of rational decision making. So how much has this contributed to the state, to the contemporary state, and how do we de-radicalize the society as a broad? I mean, I'm sure it's not that bad. You have been in Pakistan as well. People are like generally very kind and honest to each other. But obviously at the political level, this has undoubtedly.
Yeah, sure. Sure, I've traveled across Iran. People are also against the regime, but the regime is very strong and it suppresses people at multiple levels. So you introduce self-censorship, you're very cautious about what you're saying to anyone, any outsider. But of course, I want to emphasize that I've been 8 times, and the hospitality of the people is just amazing, like in the entire region in South Asia. And I never felt threatened in Pakistan. So what the people say and how people behave is like totally different, unfortunately, from what policies are being introduced. There is like rational decision making when you think about loans from China. So from the perspective of the establishment, the interactions with China and building infrastructure within the China-Pakistan economic corridor, this is a rational decision. Yeah, because China helps, China invests, but of course there is a debt trap issue, which will be a problem in the upcoming years for Pakistan for sure. What is rational from the perspective of the ruling establishment is not necessarily rational from the perspective of Pakistani society. And it's also represented, or it can be exemplified by the strategies in different regions of Pakistan, which also, again, we use this post-colonial word, resemble the post-colonial control over certain regions, like in Kashmir, like in even Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, or in Balochistan. So the future, I mean, the question is how, what impact will this always have on Pakistan? There is always this risk, which is also emotionalized and repeated, Balkanization. Yeah, if Bengal was freed with support of India, then maybe Balochistan, because they're also accused of interfering, India is accused of interfering in the situation in Balochistan. So the rationality is, this is how the establishment perceives the strategy. But Pakistan, the economy is in deep crisis. Pakistan depends on foreign loans, and interestingly, when the loan is needed, when Pakistan turns to, not to China that much, to international Western institutions, so just International Monetary Fund. Yeah, so this is always a good source of money. The question is, because Pakistan is a 250 million country, it's a nuclear power, and this is not in the interest of international community that Pakistan collapses or dwells into a huge, goes into a huge crisis. So I think there will always be an investment in Pakistan and support, but how long could it be? And how long these policies can be pursued? Again, China, it's not so easy for China and Pakistan. There are many protests in different regions. You can see that local nationalist groups, separatist groups are engaged in attacks against Chinese workers. They also have, the Chinese presence has a deep cultural, sociological impact on different regions. There are more Chinese men, for example, in the areas, which are typically very traditional. And they kind of, from this perception of some Pakistanis, they create, like, again, a state within a state. They have their own shops, they have their own schools. They don't mingle that much with Pakistanis. So, because there is a constant sense of threat among the Chinese workers, again. So the Pakistani state is engaged, and the army is engaged in protecting Chinese citizens, Chinese workers, representatives of Chinese corporations who are there in Pakistan. So there is always also a big question related to the future of China-Pakistan interaction.
Good humble he's a master student. Can you introduce yourself, please? Yeah. No, behind you.
Yes. So this is I'm doing PhD on the same topic, discussing the Wagner border.
Yeah.
I'm confused the same line of thoughts as Hussein and Professor were asking the question. I also require more theoretical specification, how to frame the emotion, because to be rational is a very relative, and as the same to be emotionally also relative will depend on conditionality or your situatedness, how you engage or you frame this emotional response. And the second part is how you relate the Wagner border to the emotional response as liberal word border or democratic values.
Yeah, you could see the emotions on the faces of the people, and this is not only just a photo, it represents the approach or the attitude which is being shaped by the history textbooks, by the emotional speeches of politicians to convince that this is the enemy and this is something that we should be concerned about. And of course, being rational, being emotional, it's always, a big discussion how to differentiate. I intentionally did not focus much on the theory because it will be there in the published chapter, but for sure I look at it from the perspective of how these emotions are politicized and to what extent They contribute to democratic, pursuing of the democratic backsliding and what impact they have on democratic institutions. And I also give these examples. I will be happy to share the published work. So then I hope that some answers will be provided.
Are there any rational responses to liberal world order or democratic values?
Typically, it's very irrational. It's deeply ingrained. It's irrationality that this is something that we should not accept. But with the exception that the financial aid is always accepted from the Western institutions. So when it comes to economic cooperation, I mean, there is an economic cooperation with the West. Pakistan is a beneficiary of the GSP Plus system with the European Union, along with Sri Lanka, I think, from the region. So when there is some benefit, like economic benefit, there are some rational discussions and rational decisions. And it has some impact on human rights. For example, the EU, it was like a few years ago, there was this Christian couple accused of blasphemy, and the EU used the argument of GSP Plus. If you want to be included in the system, you have to respect human rights. So these people were freed from prison. So certain, rational decisions. Okay, we may lose more. So let's just, okay, free them. Okay, no blasphemy.
Yes, last question. Yeah, so thank you very much for the brilliant presentation. So I think one of your very strong points here is that you brought in emotional response into the discourse on Pakistani politics, which I think is your contribution here. But my concern with your presentation is that I think there were, large parts of your presentation which was quite vague and ambiguous, just like how Pakistan was created. So the part where I thought was vague is that, when you say emotional response, you don't really define it. And the way you use the term to explain, such many decisions that Pakistan made, it seems that, this is like a one size fits all approach that, you have a list of phenomenon A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then emotional responses explains all of this. So I think from the theoretical part, I'm sure you could solve that, but it's the methodology that I'm really concerned here. And I think one way you could get around with this is to define the phenomenon that you want to explain in terms of a dependent variable. And then you can use emotional response as and give it the causal powers of explanation to explain that phenomenon. But you got to identify and narrow down the exact phenomenon that you want to explain, not just everything that happened in Pakistan.
It's not like everything that happened. I just selected certain issues.
So that within case studies, I think wasn't very clear in terms of the selection of the.
Just enumerating which phenomena I selected and used in the analysis of these within these two pillars. But maybe this should be emphasized more.
Yeah, and then alternative explanation is also important here. So you say emotional response, because the same thing now. If I just change the word emotional response to ideological response, it seems that I can explain the same phenomena that you're trying to explain.
Ideology is used, for sure. The ideology is a component that is used in emotional responses. So these two could not exist without. Yeah, this is part of these emotional responses. And I give certain examples of speeches of different leaders that I did not refer to now because of lack of time.
Yeah, sure. But I think, there's from a comparative approach, you'll see some counter examples.
Yeah.
And I think I would like to, give you some of the examples.
No, I think we stop it there.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments, and comments are very welcome. So I think we've had a very rare presentation, because what I really was kind of enamored by is the fact that, my own department is very deeply enthused with, or rather depressed with, the problem of Hindu nationalism in India.
Yeah.
Because that was an alternative rationality, we thought, which is the two-nation theory, right? So the two-nation theory was like an alternative rationality. So the Indian nation was supposed to be, of course, not perfectly constructed, but was supposed to be constructed on the idea of what in Sanskrit is called Sarva Dharma Samabhava, which means an equal attitude towards every religion. Yesterday, Dr. Harshmander gave a wonderful closing speech to a film festival where he argued that even Germany can learn from the problems that India has sought to resolve, and of course is now falling into an abyss because there are many areas where Germany fails to recognize diversity in the same way as India has been able to recognize diversity. And it was a very bold statement. He sort of talked about Germany's successes in acknowledging the past, which are second to none. And then he raised the question of how Germany is falling back to ethno-nationalism.
Yeah.
And in that context, of course, he is so much a votary of the Sarva Dharma Samabhava idea that the current government has kind of attacked him with one of the most fiercest approaches. I mean, you can't even donate money as a foreigner to Karwan-e-Mohabbat. Is now the tax status of Karwan-e-Mohabbat in India has also been taken away. So you literally can't donate any money to Karwan-e-Mohabbat in ways that you can bilaterally settle with him. So, as one who is most severely attacked, I mean, people like, Akar Patel or Pista Setalwad or Harshmander, I mean, those would be the top three people in civil society who have been attacked. And then, of course, there are people who are working more at the borderlines of constitution. And they are like, under UAPA, impoverished, and Stan Swami passed away.
Yeah, just saying
Sai
that
Baba-
the law is used
Sai
against
Baba passed away recently. There was nothing, no allegation against it, but he was released from prison just a few months before he had to go to the hospital and he died.
Yeah.
So the point I'm trying to make is that I think it is very well taken that there were two ideas of nation building. I mean, the idea of Indian nation building, which has now become very problematic in India, was certainly a certain kind of rationality. And some of us who are arguing for that rationality, look at the Constitution and say that, look, you are not ruling according to the Constitution. So we say that abrogation of Article 370, the way in which it was argued by the Supreme Court, is very problematic.
Absolutely.
Similarly, we say that the way in which the Ayodhya mosque was demolished and was defended by, and recently the Chief Justice of India said that, I was persuaded by God.
Oh, yeah.
There's a whole lot of joke around, how God persuaded. And the context is very interesting because, the Ayodhya judgment was not signed by any judge. So if you look at the Supreme Court judgments, even, there is one signature, and generally the person who signs is the person who has written the judgment. Of course, others have agreed to it. This one was an unsigned judgment, and all of us knew that the language suggests that it was D.Y. Chandrachud, because, he's a very smart guy. He writes very well. He argues very well. And we knew that the other judges couldn't have written that judgment. But the joke was that when he actually said that he was persuaded by God, everybody now understood that he is the guy who wrote the judgment. That the rest of them were also persuaded by God. No,
And
the
that's
point,
discussion, right? It's
No, that- no, no.
persuaded by God.
Yeah, no, so that's the point I'm making, that, there is a constitution, there is a rationality of the constitution, which supports a certain idea. And then you can deviate from that, right? So that's one way of looking at it. Similarly, you have a different idea of the nation, which, very nicely sort of described and you're calling that irrational, right? But it actually creates another type of rationality. And I think it is in the context of that rationality that you have to look at the deviation. For example, how many times has the Constitution of Pakistan changed? How have the rationalities kind of evolved so I think if we do that, we'll have a far more rigorous understanding of how, because, what is rational? Jesus Christ may have been rational. And, he might actually have felt that if somebody hits you, you should turn the other cheek. And the American president may also have been rational. And he might have thought that somebody like Jimmy Carter, who won the Nobel Peace Prize and was probably one of the greatest presidents in recent times, actually had to decide to support the insurgency in Pakistan. And just before that, he was not willing to put in money into General Zia's pocket. But when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, his entire policy on Pakistan changed. So I think the question, I think the material that you've given us is just very, very interesting because, we are, this context, the fact that ethnic nationalism is so dominant in the neighborhood is something that we have to really come to terms with because, all of us who study India sort of kind of ignore the fact that ethnic nationalism is so there is an alternative rationality. Jinnah may have had a very different rationality from Gandhi. And it may not have just to do with or whatever, that rationality. So, people will tell you that the British incarcerated leaders and when the Congress leaders, before that, the Congress has actually won the election. And what happened during that period when the Congress leaders were incarcerated and the British wanted to divide India was a very interesting story. I can tell you a story from the biography of Mr. P.N. Dhar, who was Principal Secretary to the Prime Minister, Kashmiri Pandit, taught at Government College Lahore. And in his biography, he writes that as a Kashmiri Pandit, when he went to teach at Government College in Lahore, everybody thought that he was a good Muslim. Because, in Urdu, he had the tehzeeb. He could actually live. A good Muslim is like a good human being. It's not like you have to be a good Muslim. So he had all the tehzeeb, and it really didn't matter that he was a Kashmiri Pandit. But then he says, when the Congress leaders got incarcerated, and when the politics turned in another direction, then he writes in his biography that you cannot imagine the same people who were behaving in a certain way, who had a certain tehzeeb in relation to his relationship with those people, had changed completely. So I do think that we should think more deeply about how states interact with people to change the way they think and the way they think what is rational is rational.
Yeah.
But there is also a way to think about how states, given the way they think, are irrational. So, for example, Shumit Ganguly has an excellent piece on the 1965 war. It's in a good referee journal. And, he tells you that Ayub Khan should have known that he can't win this war. But he had this irrational belief, especially in the aftermath of the 1962 war, where India had gotten a beating, that, if they go and attack India now, they will win. Now, that's an irrationality.
Absolutely.
Or let's say a situation where in Kargil, our own Nawaz Sharif might have encouraged the Pakistan army into a misadventure. Not calculating that, this would certainly not lead to any territorial expansion. Or, for example, the irrationality that, if you can't accommodate Bangladeshis as Muslims, then, blaming India for the partition is not going to be. So I'm just trying to think because, your presentation gives us a lot of you put in so much material, and I think the strength of the material suggests that ethno-nationalism is a real and present danger. And when you combine ethno-nationalism in a relatively small power, which has to interact with geopolitical interests, then a lot of things that can happen may not be in the long-term interests of that country, given the way in which you think, not the military thinks about the interests of that country. So I go back with a lot of very creative thoughts, and I do hope that you will pursue the question of rationality and ideology, and how ideology connects with rationality. And I think this is fascinating work on emotions. If you can tie that whole idea to emotions, and what is the difference between rationality and emotions. So thank you very much
Thank you very much.
for this very, very fascinating.